A woman by the name of Jeannie Hessel Schwartz, who was 37 years old at the time, was residing in Arlington, Massachusetts, year 1995. She had been in a relationship with a man named Mike Monahan for a good 10 years at the time of their engagement celebration. All indications from their close friends and family members suggested that they were an ideal match. They were in a relationship that was characterized by true happiness, profound affection, and a great deal of common ground in terms of interests. People looked at them and thought, yeah, that's exactly what I want. They were the kind of couple that other people admired. Since they had been together for 10 years, they had developed a life together, and they were looking forward to finally making their relationship official and spending the rest of their lives together. Exploring the great outdoors was one of the activities that they truly enjoyed doing together. Both of them were outdoorsy individuals who had a deep appreciation for the natural world, and they had been making preparations for a significant vacation for quite some time. The Yosemite National Park in California was their goal, and it was widely considered to be among the most beautiful and well-known locations in the entire country. Backpacking through the breathtaking wilderness, going on some sightseeing, and simply taking pleasure in the vacation from their regular lives on the East Coast were all things that were planned to be done during their time away from home. It wasn't until July of that year that they were finally able to realize their travel plans. Following the completion of their packing, Jeannie and Mike embarked on their journey to California, departing from Massachusetts. It was on the 9th of July, 1995, when they arrived at the Yosemite National Park gate. They had a sense of excitement and anticipation for the journey that lay ahead of them. A particular road that was only accessible during the summer months was the one that they decided to use in order to enter the park. The result of this was that the road was extremely silent and devoid of any activity. The majority of tourists did not use this corridor as their primary thoroughfare. This road was more distant and scenic, and it wound its way far into the high highlands of the park. During the course of their journey, they were surrounded by the breathtaking splendor of the Sierra Nevada mountains, but at the same time, they were on their own for the most part. They went for miles and miles without coming across another vehicle. Each of them, their car and the huge silent desert that stretched out in every direction, were the only things that were present. They were aware that they had approximately 2 to 2.5 hours of driving ahead of them on this route before they would arrive at the trailhead where they intended to begin their hiking excursion. They simply sat back and took it all in as they embarked on the lengthy and breathtaking journey. When they were about 2 hours into this drive, they were making their way up the twisting mountain route when they came upon a small turnout on the shoulder of the road. The location was intended for people to pull over, take a rest, and take in the scenery while they were there. In addition to the couple of other cars that were already parked there were also a few visitors who were standing around with cameras and taking in the breathtaking scenery. It had been some time since Jeannie and Mike had been in the car, and they had come to the conclusion that it would be beneficial for them to pull over, get out of the vehicle, and stretch their legs before continuing on to their conclusion. They drove their vehicle into the turnout, parked it, and then exited the vehicle. The atmosphere was fresh and unpolluted. As soon as Mike got out of the car, he remarked that he was interested in walking a short distance along a short trail that began close to the turnout. It had been mentioned to him that this specific location was an excellent location for bird watching, and he was eager to see if he could see anything that caught his attention. Nevertheless, Jeannie had a different point of view. She was more interested in a road that ran in the opposite way up towards a scenic overlook that promised an even better view of the valley below. This alternative path was more appealing to her. It was a petty argument between a couple that occurred on a regular basis. However, she was more interested in going in the opposite direction. They came to an agreement on a straightforward compromise. Every one of them would be able to do whatever they want. They came to an agreement to get apart for a mere 15 minutes. Both Mike and Jeannie would proceed to their own overlooks, and then they would meet back at the car. Mike would go to his bird watching area, and Jeannie would go to her viewpoint. It was a strategy that was clear and logically sound. They were in a public place that was secure and had other individuals in the vicinity. After a brief gap of 15 minutes, it appeared to be perfectly innocuous. After that, they chose to go their separate ways. In the meantime, Jeannie began climbing the slope that led to the viewpoint, while Mike continued down his trail. Mike walked down the trail for approximately 15 minutes, at which time he took pleasure in the peaceful atmosphere of the forest and searched for birds. When he realized that his allotted time had passed, he turned around and headed back up to the turnout, fully anticipating that Jeannie would be waiting for him somewhere near the car. In spite of this, the location where they had arranged to meet was vacant when he arrived there. There was no Jeannie present. And this was the year 1995. During this time period, not everyone carried a mobile phone in their backpack. Mike was unable to simply take out his phone and call her in order to inquire about her whereabouts. This was the only thing he could do. Early on, he didn't seem to be particularly concerned. It is possible that she got lost in time. Perhaps the view from the overlook was so breathtaking that she simply desired to remain there for a few more minutes than she had originally planned. He leaned on the passenger side of the vehicle, took a glance around, and waited for her to emerge from the path that she had traveled. Keeping his eyes on the tree line, he was anticipating the sight of her approaching him from behind at any moment. But after another 15 minutes had passed, there was still no trace of Jeannie anywhere in sight. At this point, a tinge of anxiety began to make its way into my mind. Now, she was 15 minutes behind schedule. In his gut, he began to experience the sensation of a knot forming. He approached the group of visitors who had been present when they had initially arrived and walked over to them. He approached them and asked, "Excuse me, have you seen a woman walk by here in the last half hour?" He went on to describe Jeannie's appearance as well as the clothes that she was wearing. Although they were friendly, the tourists shook their heads in disapproval. In contrast, they informed him that they had not come across anyone who matched that description. Mike headed back to the car, and at this point, the anxiousness was beginning to truly make its presence known. He appeared to be experiencing genuine anxiety. His eyes were fixed on the trailhead where Jeannie had vanished, and he paced back and forth between the two locations. Her name was called out by him, but the only response he received was the sound of the wind blowing through the trees. There was a further 15 minutes that passed. It was now 30 minutes past the hour that she was supposed to arrive. The original plan called for a short stroll of 15 minutes, but it turned out that they had to wait for 45 minutes. After a while, he realized that he could no longer just stand there. Something has to be done by him. He made the decision to proceed up the path that she had walked, assuming that she might have injured herself by tripping and falling, or perhaps she had simply been a little disoriented. However, as soon as he began climbing the trail, he became aware that he was facing a challenge. Almost soon, the main trail ended up branching off into a number of other smaller routes that traveled in a variety of various places. It was completely unknown to him which way she had gone. Every single one of them was a possibility for her to fall. During that brief period of time, he stood there, experiencing a flood of hopelessness wash over him. He was well aware that it would be a poor decision for him to walk aimlessly down these trails by himself. It was possible for him to become disoriented, and he was squandering valuable time. He was aware that he required assistance at this point in time. In a circumstance such as this one, time is of the utmost importance. Every minute that went by may have been extremely important. It was at the turnout that he made his turn and sprinted back to his car. Upon his arrival, he observed a member of the Park Service taking a trash can and emptying it into a dumpster, which was located a short distance away. It was a fortunate turn of events. A voice filled with terror could be heard coming from him as he ran over to the employee. His explanation of the problem was as concise and unambiguous as he could make it. "My fiancée Jeannie, she's missing," he responded. She went for a walk up that trail and was supposed to be back 30 minutes ago. She's gone. Can you please get in touch with the authorities? We need to get people up here looking for her right away. The park employee could see the genuine fear in Mike's eyes and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. We need to locate her as soon as possible. They listened to the radio and broadcasted it to the world. After Mike had finished his conversation with that worker, the first park rangers had already climbed the mountain road to reach the turnout. This occurred within 45 minutes. Mike was found there, pacing impatiently near his car. They found him there. When they started talking to him, they were able to acquire a better understanding of what had occurred. Jeannie, what she was wearing, and the precise location where she had gone were all questions that they requested him to answer. In the meantime, they made an effort to maintain his composure as they began their preliminary investigation of the situation. As they made their way up the path that she had traveled, the rangers began yelling her name and scanning the territory immediately surrounding her. On the other hand, after looking for an hour without discovering anything, the rangers realized that this was more than just a case of a hiker losing track of time. The call was placed in order to ensure that more aid from the police was sent in. The hunt for Jeannie Hessel-Schwartz was about to start in earnest, and it was going to become the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Yosemite National Park in a short amount of time. In a short amount of time, what started out as a modest and localized search conducted by a few park rangers suddenly expanded into a vast operation. An immense 40 square miles of rough and harsh terrain was added to the search area, which was enlarged to encompass the entire area. Helicopters were brought in, and as they hovered low over the dense forest canopy, their crews scanned the ground for any trace of color or any sign of a human who shouldn't be there. Their rotors thumped through the air as they swooped low over the forest canopy. On the ground, the number of people searching for the missing person increased into the hundreds. A large number of devoted volunteers, as well as park rangers and police officers, had arrived to offer assistance before the incident occurred. Those who managed dogs arrived with their highly trained search and rescue dogs with the expectation that the dogs would be able to detect Jeannie's smell and guide them to her whereabouts. The entire region was teeming with people, all of whom were working toward the same objective, which was to locate the woman who had gone missing. The enterprise served as a shining example of both dedication and efficiency. They had a command post set up, and they methodically divided the search area, which was 40 square miles in size, into a grid. To ensure that no stone was left unturned, teams were allocated to each sector of the grid, and they proceeded to search through it in a methodical manner, shoulder to shoulder. However, in spite of the extremely rapid response time, the enormous quantity of manpower, and the utilization of every resource that was presented to them, they were unable to locate anything. Despite the fact that they were fatigued and disappointed, the searchers continued to go out at daybreak and return at nightfall each and every day. Jeannie was nowhere to be found by them. The only pieces of potential evidence that they were able to locate after 2 hard weeks of this persistent searching were 2 solitary boot prints that they suspected belonged to Jeannie. They were the only pieces of evidence that they were able to find. The initial footprint was discovered in the soft ground not too far away from where Mike's car was parked, which was specifically in the general region of the location where she had been seen the last time. It was clear that this print was correct. A track from her could be found in the exact location that one would anticipate finding it. The fact that she had, at the very least, begun her walk from that location was verified by this indication. However, it was the second boot print that caused the investigators to be extremely perplexed. The second print was discovered on a route that was located some distance away. Nevertheless, this was not a typical unmarked path of any size. In that particular section of Yosemite National Park, this was one of the largest and most well-established routes. Irrespective of the fact that it was wide and that it was extremely well marked with signage, there was no way that you could have mistaken it for anything other than a primary path. As you may anticipate, the footprint of Jeannie's boots was not discovered as she was going along the trail. On the contrary, the print demonstrated that she was cutting across it in a straight line. It appeared as though she had emerged from the thick woodland on one side of the track, stepped onto the path, and then promptly moved straight over and back into the dense woods on the other side of the trail. This second print was completely incomprehensible to the knowledgeable searchers and park rangers who were employed in the search. They had witnessed the behavior of people who are lost, and this was not it. If you are lost and disoriented in the middle of the woods, and you happen to stumble upon a clearly defined and major trail, it is the same as discovering a lifeline. It is an indication of the development of civilization. That path should be followed since it is the logical and intuitive thing to do. After deciding which way to go, either left or right, you would proceed to travel along the route until it ultimately brought you to a road, a building, or other individuals with whom you would interact. Each of the primary routes in a park such as Yosemite is intended to go to a certain destination. Never in your wildest dreams would you stroll directly across a major trail and then immediately dive back into the wilderness that is devoid of any trails on the other side. For the sake of survival, it was entirely counterintuitive. In light of this, the finding of this print raised a significant amount of questions. Some of the detectives first believed that it was impossible for it to be hers because it appeared so out of character for a person who had been lost. However, the print was identical to the shoes that she was wearing, both in terms of size and tread pattern. That was her own print. That one piece of evidence revealed that Jeannie was not thinking like a typical lost person, or that something else totally was going on, was the only thing that could be considered plausible. It was a particular aspect that did not go well with the straightforward storyline of a hiker who failed to take the correct path. An additional, very peculiar and unsettling piece of information surfaced during those 2 weeks of searching, and it was revealed by the people who were handling the dogs. There were a number of different search dog teams that had been brought to the turnout where Mike and Jeannie had parked their vehicle. In this location, which was the starting point, Jeannie was proven to be the last place she was. After allowing the dog to sniff the item that contained Jeannie's fragrance, the handlers would then give the dog the command to track the item with its scent. However, each and every time they attempted to do this, the dogs were unable to detect a scent trail that appeared to be going away from the vehicle. They would smell about the vehicle, including the area where Mike claimed she began her walk, but they were never successful in determining what they were looking for. The scent that they were able to follow was never detected by them. According to the knowledgeable dog handlers, this was a significant warning sign. Someone told me that even if a person had been gone for days, a well-trained dog should be able to pick up at least some trace of their scent at the beginning location, particularly if they had traveled away from that spot on foot. This is especially true if the person had been gone for a long time. And very gloomy conclusion was reached by the handlers as a result of the absence of any scent trail at all. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that Jeannie had never in fact been present at that location. Alternatively, to be more specific, the fact that she had never walked away from that parking lot on her own before, this judgment reached by the people who handled the dogs, caused the investigation to shift its whole focus. In the event that she never left the automobile, what caused her to vanish in the first place? Those in charge of handling the investigation recommended to the primary investigators that Mike Monahan might be lying. The reasoning behind their opinion was that the entire tale of her going for a walk for 15 minutes was a fiction. They were under the impression that it was likely that Jeannie had been affected by something that had occurred either before they arrived at Yosemite or while they were still in the automobile. This whole missing hiker situation was nothing more than an elaborate scheme, a cover tale that he had concocted in order to get away with whatever kind of wrongdoing he had committed against her. When it comes to situations like this one, the spouse or partner is nearly always the first person the police look at. This was a concept that gave me chills. In addition, they now had a compelling motive to look at Mike in an extremely close and careful manner. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, also known as the FBI, became engaged as soon as it was officially suggested that there was foul activity involved. The investigation was now being handled as if it were a possible case of kidnapping or homicide. Immediately after taking control of the situation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, brought Mike Monahan in for an interview and requested that he undergo a polygraph examination, also known as a lie detector test. There is no doubt that this must have been an even more terrifying experience for Mike. In addition to the fact that the woman he had loved his entire life had vanished, he was now being investigated as the primary suspect in her disappearance. He was in a state of mourning and he was afraid, but he was aware that he had nothing to conceal. Without any reservations, he gave his consent to take the examination. The FBI investigators started interviewing him after he was connected to the equipment and the system was turned on. They questioned him about his connection with Jeannie, about the events that took place on that day, and the direct inquiries such as, did you have anything to do with Jeannie's disappearance? Do you know where she is? Mike responded to each inquiry in a calm and consistent manner. And once the examination was finished, the results were crystal clear and free of any ambiguity. Without any doubt, Mike had successfully completed the polygraph examination. The investigators came to the conclusion that he was telling the truth. He was completely exonerated of any role in the matter. That was not the end of the FBI's investigation after the polygraph test. Both Mike and Jeannie were subjected to a comprehensive and detailed background check by the organization. They investigated each and every facet of people's lives. They investigated their assets and liabilities, as well as their phone records and the connections they had with their family and friends. They spoke with a large number of persons who were familiar with them. They searched for any indication of difficulty, any secret, and any reason for their actions. Existed a lover who remained hidden? A large insurance policy was there. Were they in a financial bind? Were there any individuals who might have harbored resentment toward Jeannie or Mike before? On the other hand, during their inquiry, they found nothing at all. All of the people they talked to shared the same opinion. Mike and Jeannie were a loving, stable, and happy couple. Their foes were unknown to them. There was no evidence that they had been experiencing any kind of difficulty in their lives that could have resulted in something like this. In light of this, the authorities found themselves back at the beginning of their inquiry, which had lasted for several weeks. Although Mike had been cleared, Jeannie had not yet returned. No leads, no suspects, and no answers were found in the investigation. In a location that was both one of the most beautiful and one of the most deadly on the planet, she had suddenly disappeared into thin air. 21 days had passed. The extensive search had been terminated on the spot. The attention of the national media had begun to wane. The incident of the woman who went missing in Yosemite National Park was old news for the entire world. However, the nightmare continued each and every day for Mike Monahan and Jeannie's family who were affected by it. Then, on September 3rd, about 2 months after Jeannie had vanished, 2 guys were trekking in a very isolated region of Yosemite National Park. They were looking for Jeannie. They were fishing enthusiasts with years of expertise, and they were going to a remote location that they were familiar with in order to do some fishing. A place like this was never visited by tourists who were just passing through. In a rocky and difficult-to-reach region of the park, it was located in a remote area that was not easily accessible. They were on their way along a creek when they gazed into a pool of water and saw something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a human body there. Almost quickly, the 2 men fled the location and went to inform the park authorities about their situation. A recovery team was sent to the area, and the findings that they discovered would finally provide an answer to the mystery of what had happened to Jeannie. However, the discovery would also reveal a whole new set of questions. It was determined that Jeannie Hessel Schwartz was the person whose body was found. As the crow flies, she was discovered around 3 miles away from the turnout where Mike had seen her the last time. The only items of clothing she had on when her body was found were her socks and one of her hiking boots. None of the other boots were present. She had been submerged in that body of water for a considerable amount of time, most possibly throughout the entirety of the 2 months that followed her disappearance. A definitive cause of death could not be determined by the medical examiner since the body had been submerged in water for such a lengthy period of time, which caused the decomposition process to progress to an advanced stage. There were no clear evidence of trauma, such as a gunshot wound or a stabbing, but it was impossible to rule out other types of injuries or even drowning since there were no visible signs of trauma. Despite the fact that the place where her body was discovered made the circumstances surrounding her murder much more perplexing, the discovery of her remains brought an end to one chapter of the mystery. Investigators initially hypothesized that she may have become disoriented, strayed along a river or a brook somewhere upstream, and then drowned after falling into the water. This was the initial speculation. The current would have dragged her body down the waterway until it eventually came to rest in the pool where the fishermen discovered her. Her body would have been carried by the current. This appeared to be a horrific accident that could have been real. It would explain how she got to be in such a different place than she had started from. However, the officials of the park and the search and rescue crews that were familiar with the area swiftly disproved that hypothesis. They stated that it was extremely unlikely to occur. They indicated that the creek that flowed down to the location where she was discovered was not a river that flowed smoothly and without obstructions. The creek was a tangled mess of natural waste, and it was located in the mountains. Massive rocks, downed trees, and areas with a shallow depth were also present. They were adamant that a human body floating downstream would never have been able to make it all the way to that particular pool under any circumstances. Long before it ever arrived at that location, it would have been entangled on a log, caught up in a rock jumble, or beached in a shallow region. All of these things would have happened. It seems inconceivable that her body could have been transported there from the location where she was reported missing. In light of this, the investigators were faced with a significant challenge. In the event that she did not arrive at that location by chance, the sole other explanation would be that she had arrived there on foot. However, this appeared to be even more improbable. We conducted in-depth interviews with the fishermen who discovered her body and asked them about the site. They said that the only way to reach that particular body of water was to either climb up a steep cliff face from below using professional climbing equipment, or to rappel down a cliff face from above, once more using ropes and climbing equipment. Both of these methods were necessary in order to reach the pool of water. They characterized the region as a location that would only be visited by rock climbers who had much experience. In point of fact, the only reason they went fishing there was because they were climbers themselves and possessed the necessary gear and expertise to access the area. In order for Jeannie to have arrived at her destination on her own, she would have been required to descend a cliff face that was nearly 2,000 feet vertical. Since she was not a rock climber, she did not have any climbing equipment with her at the time. Only hiking boots were on her feet at the time. It seemed inconceivable to think that she could have successfully descended a perilous cliff that was 2,000 feet high. It was a feat that even a scubber with a high level of expertise would find exceedingly challenging, if not impossible, to do without the specific gear that was required. So since she couldn't have floated there, and she couldn't have walked or climbed there on her own, it left a third, more ominous possibility: she was carried there. The conclusion that she must have been kidnapped was reached as a result of this. Someone may have assaulted her at the turnaround and then brought her to this extremely distant place in order to conceal her body before bringing her there. This theory, however, was flawed in a significant way that appeared to be insurmountable. This would imply that her assailant would have been required to carry her down the same 2,000-foot cliff, either while she was still fighting back or after she had already passed away. Can you even fathom the logistics of that? Attempting to maneuver a tricky and perilous fall down a vertical rock face while carrying the dead weight of an adult lady could be considered a challenging situation. This appears to be just as implausible, if not more so, than the idea of her driving herself to the destination. In addition to being physically taxing, it would be an extremely dangerous endeavor. To what extent would a murderer go to such severe and perhaps hazardous lengths in order to dispose of a body? Yosemite National Park included thousands of square miles of wilderness that could be used to conceal a body with significantly less effort and risk than other places. When it came to a murder, the site was completely inexplicable. Therefore, when confronted with the sheer impossibility of the area where she was found, all of these straightforward explanations, such as an accident, a solo travel, or a homicide, appeared to break apart. The officials were at a loss for words. They were able to locate Jeannie, but they were not any closer to comprehending the manner in which she had passed away or the manner in which she had arrived in a location that she had no rational method of accessing. The case was a mystery that could not be solved in any way. A professional tracker who had been engaged in the investigation from the beginning came out with a notion that was more unusual after all of the traditional ideas had reached a point where they could not make any further progress. It was not with the intention of searching for Jeannie that this tracker returned to the location where she had vanished. Rather, it was with the intention of attempting to comprehend the surroundings from the point of view of someone who was disoriented and lost. A portion of their time was spent in the woods next to the turnout where they observed and listened, and it was at that moment that they were aware of something really unusual. When the wind blew through the leaves of a particular cluster of aspen trees in the exact correct way, it produced a sound that was remarkably similar to the sound of cars passing by on a paved road. They discovered this cluster of trees, an aural illusion was being created. According to the tracker's hypothesis, it was possible that this sound was involved in the events that transpired with Jeannie. In their novel theory, they proposed a step-by-step reconstruction of what might have occurred in the event in question. In this scenario, Jeannie goes for a walk, but she ends up getting lost and going in the opposite direction. As it begins to get darker, a feeling of terror begins to take hold of the situation. In a forest that she is not familiar with, she is alone herself, and she is unsure of which path to choose. It is then that she becomes aware of it, in the stillness of the evening. Her brain immediately recognizes the sound as that of a road at that moment. She is under the impression that she is hearing the sound of cars, which is a symbol of civilization and safety. She then begins to move in the direction of the sound. The tracker believed that this would provide an explanation for the unexplained second boot print that was found somewhere along the major path. When she was in a condition of terror and fixation, her entire attention would have been focused on that sound which signaled the presence of a road. It is quite unlikely that she would have recognized the actual trail as a route leading to safety if she had encountered it in its physical form. In her view, the only thing that mattered was the music that was being made. As she sought the source of the sounds that she believed to be her salvation, with unwavering determination, the actual trail was nothing more than an obstacle that needed to be overcome. She would have continued to follow the sound of the wind in the trees, thinking that it was a road, which would have led her farther and further into the wilderness, according to this scenario. At some point in time, her walk would have brought her to the brink of the enormous cliff that overlooked the region where her body was ultimately discovered. The darkness, the fact that she was bewildered, and the fact that she was still following the misleading sound all had the potential to cause her to slip and tumble over the edge. After that, her body would have been found in one of the rivers or pools that were located at the base of the cliff. This waterway would then have connected to the canal that went to the location where the fishermen found her. At first glance, it appeared that this hypothesis might explain a great deal. In addition to providing an explanation for why she would cross a major trail, it also offered a reasonable explanation for how she could have arrived at the base of that enormous cliff. The catastrophic event was brought on by a moment of terror and a sensory illusion that occurred at the same time. However, even this generally accepted explanation contained a huge error, and once again, it originated from the park administrators who had an in-depth understanding of the topography of that cliff. The straightforward slip and fall component of the story was met with skepticism from them. They made their way to the peak of the cliff and drew up a plan for the following steps. They came to the conclusion that it would not have been a straightforward case of her walking too close to the edge and slipping in order for her to have fallen from the top and landed in the particular length of water that would have connected to the location where her body was discovered. The cliff's base was a vast area of rock and scree that extended down the slope. It is highly likely that she would have been traveling forward with a large amount of forward momentum in order to clear that area and land directly in the ocean. If someone had done it, it would have been more of a jump than a fall. In order for her to arrive at that particular location, it appeared as though she would have had to perform a running jump off the edge of the cliff instead. In addition, that particular aspect brought all of the questions flooding back. At the same time, the concept of Jeannie, who was disoriented and in a state of panic, racing at full speed and then jumping from a cliff in the dark, did not appear to make any sense. It appeared to be excessively severe and deliberate. Is it a desperate act, or was she being forced to do it? She appeared to be fleeing from something. The investigators were left with a sense of discomfort and a collection of concerns that remained unaddressed, even when they considered the most feasible scenario. There has been no formal resolution reached regarding the case of Jeannie Hessel-Schwartz. We are left with a ghost story that takes place in one of the most breathtaking national parks in the United States. How exactly did she find herself in that pool of water that was unreachable to her? The fact that the highly trained search dogs did not pick up her scent at the car is a detail that initially raised suspicions about her fiancé and has never been fully explained. I don't understand why she went back into the woods after crossing that clearly defined track, which is a lifeline for any hiker who gets lost. The question is, what was the cause of her falling down that cliff that was 2,000 feet high in a manner that shows it was more than just a simple fall? There has never been any resolution for Mike Monahan, the individual who waited for 15 minutes, which turned out to be a lifetime of inquiries. Despite the fact that he was exonerated of any crime, he was unable to find a way to explain the disappearance of the woman with whom he had spent 10 years of his life to any reasonable explanation. It is a chilling reminder that even when a person is found, the actual truth of what happened to them can often remain lost forever in the wide, silent wilderness. Her death is a reminder of this. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the 2nd of August 1963, the Pankman family was filled with the kind of simple excitement that marks the beginning of a summer adventure. The family, a tight-knit group of 5, packed up their car and headed off to a camping resort nestled by the serene, deep lake in Washington state. There was Mr. and Mrs. Pankman and their 3 sons. 10-year-old Bill, the responsible older brother, 6-year-old Jimmy, full of energy and curiosity. And then there was 4-year-old Bobby, the youngest, who was going through a classic toddler phase of refusing to wear shoes. For him, the feel of the earth beneath his feet was a freedom he wasn't willing to give up. The first day at the campsite was perfect. They settled in, the boys explored the immediate area around their tent, and the parents, Edna and her husband, relaxed, happy to be away from the daily routine. The following day, August 3rd, started out just as promising. After breakfast, Edna had an idea. She had heard from other campers about a logging road just behind their campsite. It was supposed to lead to a beautiful little waterfall, a hidden gem she thought her boys would absolutely love to see. It sounded like the perfect little morning excursion. So, Edna got the boys ready. She told her husband she was taking them for a short walk to see the waterfall and that they wouldn't be long. He waved them off, and Edna, with Bill, Jimmy, and shoeless little Bobby, started down the path. As soon as they stepped onto the logging road, however, Edna realized the descriptions might have been a bit romanticized. The road was completely overgrown. The grass was tall, tickling their legs as they walked. The ground was uneven, a mix of rocks and bumpy dirt that had been reclaimed by nature. It was immediately clear to her that no vehicle had driven down this road in a very, very long time. This wasn't just a quiet spot. It was truly isolated. The thought was a little unsettling, but also part of the appeal of being out in the wilderness. They continued their walk, the boys chattering, enjoying the adventure of the untamed path. After a little while, they spotted a small turnoff, a less defined path that seemed to lead down towards the sound of water. This had to be the way to the waterfall. But as they got closer, Edna saw that the path was choked with thick brush, and the ground looked even rougher than the road had been. This was going to be a problem for Bobby. His bare feet had been fine on the packed dirt of the road, but this terrain of sharp sticks and rocks was too much for a 4-year-old. Edna made a quick decision. She turned to her youngest son and said, "Bobby, you need to wait here on the road for a minute." She then looked at 6-year-old Jimmy. "You stay with him. Keep him company." The plan was simple. She and Bill, the oldest, would push through the brush, go down to the water, and quickly check out the waterfall. It would only take a couple of minutes. Then she'd come right back, pick up Bobby, and they could all go down together. Bobby didn't seem to mind at all. He just sat down on the relatively clear patch of the road, perfectly content. Jimmy, on the other hand, was a little frustrated. He wanted to be in the first group, to see the waterfall with his big brother and his mom. But he did as he was told and sat down next to Bobby. And so Edna and Bill pushed past the thicket of brush and made their way down the short slope to the water's edge. Now, it's important to understand the layout here. The distance between where Edna and Bill stood by the waterfall and where Bobby and Jimmy sat on the road was only about 10 feet. It was an incredibly short distance. The only thing separating them was that dense patch of brush, which did completely obscure their view of each other. They couldn't see the boys, and the boys couldn't see them. But they were so close, they could have easily heard a shout, a cry, or any unusual noise. As Edna and Bill looked at the small cascade of water, Jimmy was sitting next to his little brother, getting more and more restless by the second. He could hear the water, he could hear his mom and brother talking, and he just couldn't stand being left out. The wait felt like an eternity to a 6-year-old. At some point, his patience just ran out. He couldn't take it anymore. And in that moment, Jimmy made a choice that he would carry with him a heavy weight of regret for the rest of his life. He stood up and he left his little brother sitting there all alone. Jimmy scrambled through the brush, emerging by the water where his mom and Bill were. As soon as Edna saw him, she was annoyed. She looked at him sternly and said, "What are you doing? You left Bobby up there all by himself. Come on." She didn't waste another second. They had only been down by the water for about 60 seconds in total. A single minute. She turned right around, with Bill and Jimmy in tow, and they all pushed back through the brush and up onto the road. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. At first, there was no real alarm. The immediate thought wasn't that something terrible had happened. It couldn't have. They were in the middle of nowhere. They hadn't seen another person all morning. They hadn't heard a single sound other than their own voices and the birds. Edna's first reaction was simple annoyance, mostly directed at Jimmy for not staying put. She assumed Bobby had gotten up to wander. Maybe he was hiding behind a tree, playing a little game. Or perhaps he'd just walked a few feet down the hill. So they started calling for him. "Bobby? Where are you?" They walked around the immediate area, peering behind trees and into the tall grass. No one was panicking yet. It was just an inconvenience, a brief delay in their morning walk. But after a couple of minutes of calling his name with no response, a small seed of worry began to sprout. Bobby wasn't answering. They couldn't see him anywhere. The annoyance started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Edna began to feel a knot tightening in her stomach. She started yelling louder, her voice now edged with panic. She sent Bill and Jimmy to look down by the water again to check every possible spot, but there was absolutely no trace of him. It just didn't make any sense. He was 4 years old. He had no shoes on. He couldn't have gone far in such a short amount of time. And how could he have disappeared without them hearing anything? He was just gone. The panic was now in full bloom. After a few more frantic minutes of searching the same small area over and over, Edna knew this was a situation she couldn't handle on her own. She gathered her other two boys, their faces pale with confusion and fear, and they ran. They ran as fast as they could all the way back down the overgrown logging road to the campsite. They burst into the camp, and Edna frantically explained to her husband what had happened. They immediately got help and called the police. Very quickly, a massive search operation was launched on that lonely logging road. When the police arrived, the first thing they did was sit down with Edna, Bill, and Jimmy. They pressed them, gently but firmly, about what they had heard. "You had to have heard something," the officers explained. "He was only 10 feet away from you. He was definitely within earshot. Did you hear a car? An animal? Did you hear anyone talking? Anything at all?" But Edna and the boys could only shake their heads, their expressions a mixture of bafflement and terror. They swore up and down that they had heard nothing. The woods had been completely silent. They were just as confused as anyone else. This left the police with a very difficult starting point. They had no idea where Bobby could have gone. They carefully surveyed the area. There were no steep cliffs or drop-offs nearby. No obvious places a small child could have fallen into or become trapped. The waterfall itself fed into a tiny, shallow brook. It would be difficult for anyone, let alone a 4-year-old, to drown in it. With no clues to go on, the searchers had no choice but to simply fan out in all directions, a combing operation through the dense woods, hoping to find a piece of clothing, a footprint, or any other sign that would tell them which way he went. For 3 long, agonizing days, hundreds of searchers scoured the forest. They found nothing. Finally, they decided to bring in a bloodhound to try and track Bobby by his scent. They brought one of Bobby's shoes from the campsite for the dog to smell. The moment the dog was given the scent, it seemed to lock on immediately. It got very excited, its nose to the ground, and started pulling the handler right near the area where Bobby had last been seen. Then the dog turned and started running up the logging road away from the campsite deeper into the forest. It ran for nearly 2 miles, never seeming to lose the scent. It was clearly and confidently tracking Bobby. The dog finally stopped at a fork in the road, about 2 miles from where Bobby had disappeared. It keyed in on one specific area right at the fork. It was just a bare patch of dirt. There was nothing significant about it at all. The police were hopeful. They dug into the dirt a little, but there was nothing there. They scanned the entire area looking for any sign that Bobby had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items. They brought the dog back a little way and gave it the scent again. And again, the dog went right back to that exact same patch of dirt at the fork in the road and refused to move on. The dog was certain the trail ended there, but the investigators didn't know what to do with that information. It was a dead end with no explanation. After 7 days of exhaustive searching that yielded absolutely nothing, the search for Bobby Pankman was officially called off. The lead investigator held a press conference. His face was grim as he told the reporters that they had no idea what had happened to Bobby. However, he stated that they did believe he was abducted. His reasoning was straightforward and logical. Bobby was a very young child with no shoes on, in a forest he didn't know. He was out of his mother's sight for, at most, 2 minutes. How far could he have really gotten on his own in that time? Certainly not far enough that his family and a massive search party wouldn't have found him. But if you go down the abduction theory, you run into a whole new set of problems. For a person to have taken Bobby, that person had to be on that extremely isolated, overgrown logging road at that exact moment. The Pankmans hadn't seen anyone else the entire time they were there. And there were very few other campers at the resort. This suggests that if a person did abduct Bobby, they must have been planning it. They would have had Ohat been hiding in the trees, stalking the family, waiting for an opportunity. And then you have to consider the opportunity itself. It was a tiny 2-minute window that opened up completely by chance when Jimmy decided to leave his brother's side. It wasn't an obvious moment. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which you would think would have been a deterrent to any would-be kidnapper. But as soon as that window presented itself, this person would have had to run out from the tree line, run over to Bobby, pick him up without Bobby making a single sound, muffle him somehow, and then run away back into the woods carrying a child, all within that 2-minute time frame. It just seemed like the person who could do that would need to be incredibly fixated on Bobby specifically, and there was no reason for anyone to be. And 2, they would need to be extraordinarily strong, fast, and agile. We're talking about someone with the physical fitness of a professional athlete. While it's certainly possible that a highly athletic individual had been stalking this family and executed a flawless, silent abduction in a tiny window of opportunity and then evaded a massive search for 7 days in the woods, it just seemed incredibly unlikely. Investigators reached this same conclusion. They thought the human abduction theory, while the most likely, was still full of holes. So they moved on to considering animals. Maybe a bear had taken Bobby. They brought in specialized bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for any signs of recent bear activity. The dogs found nothing. So they moved on. Okay, maybe it was a cougar. They brought in a cougar expert to examine the area. The expert found no tracks, no scat, no signs of a cougar anywhere nearby. Plus, a key piece of evidence was missing facing a large predator attack. There was no blood anywhere, and there were no drag marks in the dirt. If a predator were to grab a child, it would have to drag them away, and that would leave a very clear trail. There was none. With the large predator theory also seeming unlikely, someone offered up another idea. Maybe a giant eagle had swooped down, picked Bobby up, and flown away with him. This would account for the silence, the lack of drag marks, and the lack of blood. It would explain why he just vanished. But that was the point when authorities knew they were grasping at straws. They had no clue what had happened. And that's why the investigator at the press release basically said, "We just don't know." And so while we will probably never know for sure what happened to 4-year-old Bobby Pankman, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent. It was fast, strong, and agile. And it had been watching that family because as soon as that 2-minute window of vulnerability presented itself, it swept in so fast and so silently that no one saw it, no one heard it, and it took Bobby somewhere. And whatever it did to him, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormack Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. He was the kind of man who couldn't sit still for long. He was feeling bored and restless and decided he wanted to do something fun with his 16-year-old son, James McCormack Jr. The two of them were very close and shared a love for the outdoors. They were both avid and experienced hunters. So they settled on going hunting together. They chose Larch Mountain as their destination. Even though it was only about 30 miles from the city, Larch Mountain had a reputation. It was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the entire northwestern United States. On December 4th, the two men, along with their loyal hunting dog, headed out. They arrived at the base of the mountain, excited for the day ahead. They hopped out of their car, put on their gear, and began their hike into the vast wilderness. The weather forecasters had predicted a cold day with a chance of some light snow, but overall, the weather was supposed to hold. It was just supposed to be a day trip. They planned to be back home by nightfall, so they hadn't brought any equipment for an overnight stay. They had warm clothes, some food, and water, but no tent or shelter. After walking for several hours deep into the mountains, they started to notice a dramatic shift in the weather. The temperature was dropping rapidly, much faster than they had anticipated. Then, a light rain began to fall. And then, within a very short period of time, that rain turned into heavy, wet snow. Initially, they thought they could gut it out. They were tough guys, and they didn't want a little bad weather to ruin their trip. But soon, the snow was coming down so hard and their gear was getting so wet that they decided it was time to call it a day. It was awful, and it was going to get dark soon. So they agreed to turn around and head back to the truck. They could always go hunting another day. But the snow had come on so quickly and was so thick that when they turned around to retrace their steps, the landscape looked completely different. Everything was covered in a fresh, white blanket that disguised all the landmarks they had been using. They didn't have a GPS, of course. They were navigating with a map and compass. And they weren't on a marked trail. They had been bushwhacking, just walking through the mountains looking for a good spot to set up. So they started walking in the direction they believed was back to their vehicle. They made turns they thought were correct, but they soon started to question where they were. After walking for several more hours, they realized they weren't anywhere near a road. They were in an area they didn't recognize at all. And the sinking feeling hit them. They were lost. By this point, it was snowing really hard, and the liquid of the daylight was fading. The pair decided they had no choice. They had to spend the night out in the wilderness. They weren't going to find their vehicle in the dark, especially now. Their best bet was to find a place to camp out for the night and try again in the morning. But remember, they had no tent, no sleeping bags, nothing to protect them from the elements. They decided their best option was to climb up into a large tree. At least that way, they would be off the frozen ground. It would offer some protection from potential predators, and the thick branches of the evergreen would shield them a little bit from the relentless snow and freezing rain. That night was a sleepless, miserable ordeal. James Sr., James Jr., and their dog huddled together in that tree, shivering uncontrollably as they were just destroyed by the storm. The snow and freezing rain never let up, and the wind howled through the branches. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun came up the next morning. It brought a glimmer of hope, although it was still absolutely dumping snow on them. They were cold and exhausted, but they were still optimistic. They were thinking to themselves, this is going to make one heck of a story when we finally get back home. And so they carefully climbed out of the tree, their limbs stiff and sore. They stretched, trying to get some feeling back into their bodies, and then they began walking again in a direction they hoped would lead them to their vehicle. For several hours, they just trudged through the deep snow, hoping to stumble upon the road. But they didn't. At some point, they stopped, and the reality of their situation hit them once again. They were in the exact same position as the day before. They still had no idea where they were, and now they had potentially walked even farther in the wrong direction. James Sr. pulled out his map, trying to make sense of their location. He was looking at the terrain around them, trying to match it to the contours on the map, looking for any clue about which way they should be going. As he was doing this, his son, who had been a really tough kid up to this point and hadn't complained about anything, said to his dad that he was feeling delirious. He said he felt like he couldn't think straight and that it was even hard for him to stand. He was going to sit down for a minute. At first, his dad wasn't overly concerned. They had just spent a miserable night in a tree. It made sense that his son would be tired and feeling out of it. And they had been well rested before the trip. They had only been out in the elements for one full day. They still had warm clothes, food, and water. He figured his son would just sit down for a minute, catch his breath, and then he'd be rejuvenated and ready to keep moving. So, James Sr. continued to study his map, looking around, waiting for his son to say he was ready to go. But his son just continued to deteriorate. He started speaking in nonsense, and he couldn't get up on his own. This was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel a deep, cold fear for their actual safety. Even the night before, huddled in the tree, it had just felt like a crazy adventure that they would eventually overcome. Even that morning when they woke up and it was still snowing and they were still lost, he had held on to that optimism, and so had his son. But now, he was thinking that they were potentially staring down another night out in the storm. They were going to eventually run out of food and water. Their clothes were getting soaked through. The temperatures were dropping well below freezing. And now, something was seriously wrong with his son. This was concerning on its own, but it also meant that if his son couldn't move, they couldn't make any progress towards getting out of this situation. James Sr. was a very fit man. As a fireman, he was used to physically demanding situations. He looked at his son and said, "Okay, I'm going to pick you up, and I'm going to carry you." He hoisted his son up in a fireman's carry, draping him over his shoulders. And for 3 solid hours, James Sr. just continued to march through the deep snow, carrying his son, desperately looking for the way out. After 3 hours, when they had not gotten any closer to a road or any sign of civilization, and it was now getting dark again, he finally collapsed from exhaustion. He gently put his son down by a tree and sat down next to him, totally defeated. He told his son they had to get ready for another night. They had to get back up in a tree and do it all over again. As they were sitting there, talking about how they were going to get James Jr. up into a tree, since he was now too weak to climb up himself, they both noticed something strange. About 100 feet in front of them, there were 2 very bright lights that looked exactly like headlights. James Sr.'s heart leaped. "Oh my goodness, what luck," he thought. "There's a road right there that we just didn't see, and there's a car parked on it." He turned to his son and said, "I'm going to go up and talk to them, tell them we're stuck out here, and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here, I'll be right back." So, James Sr. got up and started running towards those lights. They were his lifeline. He wanted to get to them before the car potentially pulled away, not realizing there were 2 people in desperate need of help just a few yards away. As he was running, covering 50, 60, 70 feet, he noticed the lights seemed to be moving farther and farther away from him. James Sr. stopped in his tracks. He stood there, panting, looking at these lights and thinking, "Are those really headlights? What are those lights?" And then, at some point, the lights just seemed to drift off into the forest, and then they were gone. James Sr. looked around and realized there was no road over there. He was still in the middle of the deep woods. What were those lights? He stood there for a minute, a wave of confusion and fear washing over him. Was he losing his grip on reality? What was going on? He turned around and started running back to where he had left his son and his dog. But when he got there, only his dog was there. His son was gone. What was going through James Sr.'s mind was, how is this possible? His son couldn't even walk just a few minutes ago. He certainly wouldn't have lied to him and made him carry him all this way. There was just enough light left from the dusk and the reflection off the snow that he could still see footprints on the ground. He saw the backpack his son had left by the tree. He grabbed it, he grabbed his dog, and he started yelling for his son at the top of his lungs. And he started following the single set of footprints that led away from the tree, the footprints that had to have been left by his son. He's walking along these tracks, yelling his son's name, but he's hearing nothing back. And this whole time, he's thinking to himself, why would he even leave? Even if he suddenly could move, why would he leave me? We're in this together. What is going on with my son? He kept walking, following the tracks, but the snow was still coming down so heavily that the prints were getting harder and harder to see. They were filling in with fresh snow almost as fast as he could follow them. Finally, it got completely dark, and he couldn't see the prints at all anymore. Now, James Sr. was absolutely panicked. This was a complete nightmare. Where was his son? What were those strange lights? And now he was facing another night out here, all alone. He just picked a random direction, holding on to his son's belongings with his dog by his side, and he just started running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog stumbled into a lodge. It was about 6 miles away, as the crow flies, from where they had originally parked their car at Larch Mountain. Of course, that doesn't mean they only traveled 6 miles. They had likely zigzagged all over the mountain, covering a much greater distance. It was a miracle that he had found it. He had basically run all night until he hit a road, and then he followed that road until it led him to this lodge. He stumbled inside, hypothermic and exhausted, and told the staff that his son was missing. He told them they had been lost for 2 days, and his son was out there in the middle of the woods, hurt, and they needed to go find him. Very quickly, the police were called. Word spread to the fire department in Portland that the fire inspector's son was missing. In an incredible show of solidarity, 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain to help with the search. The paramedics at the lodge wanted James Sr. to go straight to the hospital. He was in bad shape. But he was not about to leave his son. He refused all medical attention and insisted on going out with the very first group of searchers. Somehow, in his exhausted and disoriented state, he was able to lead them back to the rough area where his son had been sitting when he disappeared. They began to search that area, and very quickly they found James Jr.'s glasses case. A little farther on, they found his boots and his socks just sitting in the snow. But there was no sign of James Jr. himself. Later that day, though, they would find him. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and glasses case were found. He was at the bottom of a cliff, and he was deceased. Initially, the searchers thought the story was straightforward. He must have gotten confused, wandered away from where his dad told him to sit, and tragically fallen off the cliff. But the medical examiner determined that he did not die from the fall. The evidence showed he had made his way down to the base of that cliff and then died of exposure. This left everyone with a series of baffling questions. How was James Jr. suddenly able to walk again after being so weak he had to be carried? And once he regained that ability, why didn't he go towards his dad or call out for him? Why did he walk away from him? And perhaps most strangely, why did he take his shoes and socks off in a blizzard to do it? And what were those mysterious lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? They weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that his son suddenly got up and walked away into the storm. In early July of 1953, the Huggen family was preparing for a long-awaited summer vacation. Mr. and Mrs. Huggen, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week retreat. They were heading to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario. This wasn't a bustling tourist town. Wade was, and still is, one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was situated right in the middle of a huge, swampy forest, and it wasn't far from one of the biggest lakes in the area, a body of water called Fox Lake. The family arrived late in the evening on July 4th. After the long drive, they were too tired to do much of anything. They just unpacked the essentials, got the girls settled, and went to bed, dreaming of the weeks of relaxation and adventure ahead. Early the next morning, the adults in the cabin decided they wanted to take the girls down to Fox Lake for the day. So they began the busy process of gathering all the supplies they would need, towels, snacks, fishing gear, and everything else for a full day by the water. While the adults were busy packing, the three girls were allowed to play outside the cabin. It was a completely safe environment, or so they thought. There were no neighbors for miles around. The cabin was an isolated outpost in the wilderness. It was totally normal to let the children play by themselves just outside the door. They weren't concerned about someone taking them. The two older girls played together in the front yard of the cabin. 5-year-old Geraldine, the youngest, was playing by herself on the side of the cabin. This meant the two girls in the front couldn't see Geraldine, and she couldn't see them. The adults were keeping a general eye on all three girls. They were mostly going in and out of the cabin, grabbing things for their trip, and they would periodically poke their heads out the windows or the door to check on them. And every time they looked, the girls were fine, happily playing in the morning sun. At around 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car. They were ready to go. They went outside to collect the girls to head over to the lake. They gathered the two older girls who were playing out front, and then they walked around to the side of the house to get Geraldine. But they couldn't find her. At this initial moment, they weren't worried. She was a 5-year-old. Where could she have possibly gone? They walked around the entire house, calling her name. Geraldine? They asked the two older girls if they had seen her, where she had gone. And they just said they didn't know, that she was just playing on the side of the house a minute ago. When they couldn't find her outside, they went back into the cabin, thinking she must have slipped inside without them noticing. That seemed to be the only other place she could possibly be. But after a thorough search of the small cabin, looking under beds and in closets, and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults started talking to each other, trying to establish a timeline. Did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her recently? And they all said yes. They had all poked their heads out a window or a door at some point and had seen her playing right on the side of the cabin within the last 10 minutes. They all agreed on this. In the last 10 minutes, she was right there. So now they were alarmed. They couldn't find her, but they were still thinking they were going to find her any second. They went back outside and began looking around again, this time yelling for her with more urgency. Now, this was such a remote section of Ontario that there was virtually no noise pollution. Sound travels incredibly well out there. When they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. Even if Geraldine had sprinted as fast as her little legs could carry her for 10 solid minutes away from the cabin, she still would have been easily within earshot. All she had to do was yell back, and they would have heard her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. At this point, the family was panicking. They called the police. When the police showed up, they took one look at the vast, dense wilderness surrounding the cabin and knew they were going to need a lot more help. They weren't going to be able to search this area effectively on their own. This was a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. So they called in some professional trackers, local men who were intimately familiar with this rugged terrain to come and help them. They also called the army base in Winnipeg to send over some soldiers to assist in the search as well. But just as the search was getting organized and underway, the skies opened up. A torrential downpour began, dumping rain all over the entire area. It basically washed away any footprints or tracks that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set, there was still no sign of Geraldine. Her father, his heart breaking, said something to the searchers that was intended to help them, but it was just an incredibly sad comment. He told them that his daughter was terrified of the dark, and that once it got dark out in these woods, she would be too scared to move. She would just sit down and cry. He was hoping this meant she wouldn't wander farther away and that they would be able to find her. But they didn't find her that night. For 3 days, they looked everywhere for her. Hundreds of people combed the woods. There was no trace of her at all. And to make matters even worse, the weather had turned really rainy and cold. The temperatures weren't below freezing, but they were close, down in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And Geraldine was only wearing a light shirt and shorts. She was not prepared for this kind of weather. On the evening of the third day, they finally found a clue. They found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's. They were high up on a mossy ledge that overlooked Fox Lake. The footprints indicated that a small child, probably Geraldine, had stood there looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swampy area below. Her footprints then dissipated into the muck and water of the swamp. So, the entire search effort was now focused on the swamp. They had thousands of people combing through this mosquito-infested, dense bush looking for the little girl. And once again, they found nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they found another set of footprints in the swamp near the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints. These were huge prints. If it was a human print, it would have to belong to an enormous human being. Or the prints belonged to some kind of enormous animal. But they were unable to determine what kind of animal it was. At this point, although there was no real evidence connecting that strange print to Geraldine, people were starting to suspect that whoever or whatever left this print had something to do with her disappearance. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine had gone missing, some of the professional trackers made another discovery. They were 2.5 miles away from where that large print had been found in the swamp, and where Geraldine's own footprints had been found on the ledge. On the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake, they found a small piece of her plaid shirt snagged on a bush. And so they moved the entire search effort over to that section of Long Lake. And within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of her. From what remained, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. The initial thought was that she must have been attacked by wolves, and that's what killed her. But upon a closer inspection of her remains, they saw that her clothing had not been torn, and there was no blood on her clothes. This suggested that the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was already deceased. A wolf attack would have shredded the clothes, and there would be obvious marks indicating an attack. But here, it seemed the animals had picked around the clothing. Geraldine's remains also appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to the spot where she was ultimately located. So, the investigators followed the drag line into this meadow. It led them to a clearing where all the grass had been matted down in a large oval shape. Investigators said it looked like something very big had been lying there. They speculated that this might have been the area where Geraldine had actually been killed, and that afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was eventually found. And so the investigators are thinking, we found that huge unidentified footprint in the swamp on the 7th day, in the same general area where we had found Geraldine's own footprint. We thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large impression, what appears to be a body print from something huge in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so, it seems probable that whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this impression here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left the investigators with two theories, and neither of them really made any sense. The first one was that these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belonged to an enormous person, a giant of a man, who ran up to the cabin in broad daylight, silently abducted Geraldine, and ran off into the woods without anyone seeing or hearing them. And then, for weeks, this giant person managed to totally evade capture, despite, again, being an enormous person lumbering through the forest. That just seemed really unlikely. One, the place giant person even existed, and two, that if they did exist, how could they not get caught? They would be so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory. This makes a little more sense on the surface, because there are enormous predators in the wild that have on rare occasions attacked humans. So that does happen. But when the experts looked at her remains, they had already ruled out a wolf attack. And really, they had ruled out all known animal attacks based on the state of her clothing. So if this was some enormous, unknown predator, how did it kill Geraldine without leaving a trace on her clothes? The family was told that, unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they were unable to determine an official cause of death. Their best guess, they told the family, was that she was probably mauled by wild animals. But privately, they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. You know, people love to say the woods are peaceful. Quiet, safe. But the terrifying thing about all three of these stories is that nothing sounded wrong before those people vanished. No screams. No struggle. No warning. Just a child sitting 10 feet away, a son waiting beside a tree, a little girl playing outside her family's cabin, and then suddenly, nothing. As if the forest itself reached out and erased them. And maybe that's what makes cases like these so unsettling. Not the idea that something is out there in the woods, but the possibility that it can stand right beside you, silently watching, and you'd never know it was there until it decides to take you. Thank you so much for watching. Imagine living in a city of over 3.5 million people, where the streets are a constant roaring sea of traffic, dust, and heat. This is Ibadan, one of the largest and most populated cities in Nigeria. In a place this massive, it is incredibly easy to feel lost or ignored. But for a specific group of young men, they found their community on the back of two wheels. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are known as Okadas. They are the lifeblood of Ibadan, weaving through gridlock to get people to work, school, and home. Because their job is tough and often dangerous, the Okada riders developed a remarkably tight-knit brotherhood. They would gather at specific spots along the city streets, waiting for fares, sharing food, and talking about their lives. They looked out for one another. If a rider went down, the others would help him. If a rider got into trouble with a difficult customer, a dozen others would show up to back him up. They knew each other's routines, families, and dreams. So, in the early months of 2014, when two of these riders suddenly stopped showing up to their usual spots, the entire Okada community noticed immediately. At first, their friends and families held out hope that maybe they had just taken a long-distance fare or gone to visit relatives in another town. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence grew deafening. The families went to the local police to report the men missing, but the police did not seem to care very much. They brushed the families off, suggesting that the young men had probably just walked away from their lives to find better jobs in a different city, or that they had simply run off to avoid some debts. The Okada riders knew this was not true. These men loved their jobs and would never just abandon their families and their valuable motorcycles without saying a word. Realizing that the authorities were not going to lift a finger, the Okadas decided to take matters into their own hands. They launched an informal, citywide search. As they went about their daily shifts, dropping off passengers in every corner of Ibadan, they kept their eyes peeled. They rode down narrow side streets, checked dark alleys, and asked shopkeepers if they had seen their missing brothers. But despite their constant vigilance, they found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. Then, on March 22nd of that same year, a third Okada rider vanished. His name was Lanre Sadiku. Lanre was a young, hard-working guy who was incredibly popular among his peers. He was always smiling, quick with a joke, and incredibly reliable. Unlike the first two riders who had disappeared during their off hours, Lanre went missing right in the middle of a busy workday. On that afternoon, Lanre was hanging out at his usual meetup spot on a bustling city street, waiting for his next fare. His fellow riders were right there with him, chatting and enjoying the afternoon sun. Eventually, two men walked up to Lanry and asked for a ride. Lanry agreed. The two passengers climbed onto the back of his motorcycle, and he kicked the engine over and drove away. In Ibadan, Okada trips are typically very short. Drivers usually take passengers just a few miles down the road, drop them off, and head straight back to their designated stations to pick up the next fare. It was an assembly line of quick trips. But as the afternoon faded into evening, Lanry still had not returned. At first, his friends at the meetup spot figured he might have landed a rare, high-paying passenger who wanted to go all the way to the other side of the city. But when 3 hours passed, then 4, a deep sense of unease settled over the group. One of the riders pulled out his phone and dialed Lanry's number. It went straight to voicemail. This was highly unusual. For an Okada rider, a cell phone is their most vital business tool. It is how clients reach them, how they coordinate rides, and how they make their living. They never, under any circumstances, turned their phones off during a shift. Now, everyone at the station was deeply worried. They stood in a circle, debating what to do, when suddenly a phone began to ring. But it was not the phone they had just called. Lanry actually kept 2 cell phones on him. He had his main, public work phone, and then he had a private, secondary phone that only his closest friends and family knew about. And it was this second, private phone that was now calling one of the riders at the station. The rider answered the call instantly and put it on speakerphone so everyone could hear. But instead of a casual greeting from Lanry, the speaker erupted with a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Lanry was screaming hysterically into the receiver. His voice was cracked, frantic, and filled with tears. He was begging for help. He told his friends that he had been kidnapped. He explained that his captors had blindfolded him and thrown him into an underground room. He said he was not alone. There were 8 other people down there with him, individuals he had never seen before in his life, and they were all locked in this pitch-black, suffocating underground cell. Lanry said they could hear the heavy, muffled footsteps of people walking around on the ceiling directly above them, but they could not see anything at all. In the background of the call, the other riders could hear a terrifying chorus of screams and wails. The other 8 captives were screaming as loud as they possibly could, trying to make enough noise so that whoever was walking above them might hear them and let them out, or perhaps hoping the voice on the other end of the line would hear their desperation. Lanry explained that when they were captured, the kidnappers had aggressively searched them and confiscated all of their belongings, including their wallets and their primary cell phones. But in their haste, the kidnappers had completely missed the small secondary phone that Lanry kept tucked away in a hidden pocket. That tiny mistake was their only lifeline. The riders holding the phone were absolutely horrified. They tried to calm Lanry down, shouting into the speaker for him to take a deep breath and tell them where he was so they could come get him. Lanry took a ragged breath and tried to compose himself. He told them he did not know the exact coordinates, but he had managed to pay close attention to the route while he was being transported. He told them they needed to get onto the main highway leading out of Ibadan and head toward the outskirts of the city. He said they needed to look for the dense, dark tree line of the Soka forest. Right at the edge of the woods, where a narrow dirt footpath began, they would see 2 rusted, burned-out cars. Lanry told them that if they found those cars and followed that footpath deep into the Soka forest, they would eventually hear the voices of the captives crying out from beneath the ground. He begged them to hurry, because he did not know how much time he had left before the captors returned and discovered his hidden phone. The riders at the station yelled back that they were coming right now. They told him to stay on the line, to keep talking to them so they could use his voice as a guide once they entered the woods. But right as they said those words, the line abruptly went dead. They tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. The phone had either been turned off, run out of battery, or worse, discovered by the kidnappers. There was no time to lose. Approximately 40 Okada riders from Lanre's meetup spot immediately ran to their bikes, kicked them into gear, and roared out onto the city streets. They drove in a massive, tight formation, weaving through traffic and ignoring traffic lights as they sped toward the highway. They pushed their motorcycles to their absolute limits until they left the concrete jungle of Ibadan behind and the dark, imposing trees of the Soka forest appeared on their left. They slowed down, scanning the shoulder of the road, looking for the landmark Lanre had described. Sure enough, after a few miles, they spotted the skeletal, rusted remains of two burned-out cars parked right at the edge of the woods. The riders pulled over, parking their bikes on the side of the highway. They looked at the entrance to the footpath. It was incredibly narrow and heavily overgrown with thick vines, tall weeds, and dense brush. It was completely impassable for their motorcycle. They realized they would have to continue on foot. Unarmed and completely unprepared for what might lie ahead, the 40 men stepped past the rusted cars and onto the path. The forest was thick and dark, blocking out much of the late afternoon sun. Because the trail was so narrow, they had to walk in a single file line, moving quietly through the brush. They did not make a sound. They were straining their ears, trying to catch the faint sound of Lanre's voice or the screams of the other captives coming from beneath the dirt. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs under their boots. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Suddenly, the rider at the very front of the line froze. He holds up his hand, signaling for everyone behind him to stop. They all went dead silent, holding their breath, listening. Then, about 50 feet ahead of them, the thick foliage parted. A man they had never seen before leaped out from behind a massive tree. He screamed something at them in a harsh, angry tone. Before anyone could react, the man raised a heavy gun and began firing directly at the line of riders. The loud cracks of gunfire shattered the silence of the forest. The 40 Okada riders, completely defenseless, turned on their heels and sprinted back down the path as fast as their legs could carry them. They burst out of the tree line, threw themselves onto their motorcycles, and peeled out onto the highway, racing back toward the safety of the city. When they finally got back to their meetup spot, they were trembling and out of breath. They gathered in a tight circle to discuss what had just happened. They knew they could not just abandon Lanre and the other captives. If they did nothing, those people would surely die. They briefly considered going to the police, but after the lazy and dismissive response they had received regarding the first two missing riders, they knew the police would take hours, if not days, to organize any kind of response. By then, it would be far too late. They decided they had to handle this themselves, but they needed a much bigger force. The riders began calling every Okada meetup spot in the surrounding areas. They explained the situation, the phone call from Lanre, the gunman in the woods, and the urgent need for backup. The response was overwhelming. Within a very short amount of time, over 100 Okada riders assembled at the edge of the city. This time, they were not defenseless. They had gathered a makeshift arsenal of weapons. Some carried heavy iron bars, others had thick wooden clubs, sharp knives, machetes, and even a few crude firearms. They were no longer a helpless search party, they were an angry, determined mob. They climbed back onto their bikes and roared down the highway, a massive convoy of headlights cutting through the descending twilight. When they arrived back at the Soka forest, they parked their motorcycles in a massive row along the shoulder of the highway. They bypassed the two burned-out cars and marched onto the narrow footpath. But this time, they made absolutely no attempt to be quiet. They marched shoulder to shoulder where they could, waving their weapons in the air and letting out loud, terrifying war cries. They wanted the gunmen and anyone else hiding in those woods to know that a massive, angry horde was coming for them and they were ready for a fight. They marched deep into the forest, fully expecting to be shot at any moment. But the woods remained eerily quiet. The gunman from before had apparently fled, terrified by the sheer volume of noise and the size of the incoming mob. After walking for what felt like miles through the dense vegetation, the path suddenly opened up. The thick trees gave way to a massive circular clearing in the middle of the forest. Flowing right through the center of this clearing was a small but deep river with fast-moving water. It would have been incredibly difficult to cross on foot, but spanning the water was an old, crumbling stone bridge. On the far side of this bridge, sitting in the gloomy twilight, were two dilapidated buildings. The first building, located closest to the bridge, was a small, weather-worn shack made of dark plywood. It had a single dirty window that looked out toward the path. The second building, situated further back in the clearing, was a massive warehouse-like structure with high, crumbling concrete walls. Surrounding this large warehouse was a tall, rusted chain-link fence with thick coils of rusty barbed wire wrapped tightly around the top. The entire place looked completely abandoned, like an old, forgotten industrial site rotting away in the middle of the wilderness. The mob of Okada riders slowed their pace as they stepped into the clearing, their eyes scanning the dark structures for any sign of movement. As they approached the crumbling stone bridge, one of the riders glanced down at the muddy banks of the river below. He gasped and pointed. Tucked away under the shadow of the stone arch, partially hidden by tall river reeds, was Lanre's motorcycle. It had been driven down here, pushed off the path, and hidden away. This was the absolute proof they needed. Lanre was here, or at least he had been very recently. The riders surged across the bridge, their anger and adrenaline reaching a boiling point. They ran straight to the small plywood shack. One of the men kicked the door open, ready to face an attacker, but the tiny building was empty. However, what they saw inside the shack made them pause in confusion. The small room was packed from floor to ceiling with hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing. There were piles of shirts, pants, dresses, children's clothes, and hundreds of pairs of shoes. There were also wallets, bags, and personal identification cards scattered everywhere. It looked like a bizarre, silent museum of lost people. Confused and deeply unsettled, the mob backed out of the shack and turned their attention to the massive concrete warehouse behind the barbed wire fence. They stood before the fence, shouting for whoever was inside to show themselves, but only silence echoed back from the concrete walls. One of the riders had brought a pair of heavy bolt cutters to use as a club. He stepped forward, bent down, and began cutting through the thick metal links of the fence. He worked quickly, cutting a massive, jagged hole in the barrier. The riders squeezed through the opening one by one, stepping onto the overgrown ground inside the perimeter. The warehouse was silent. The windows were set very high up on the concrete walls, making it impossible to see inside. But as they walked around the perimeter of the building, a horrific, overpowering stench began to wash over them. It was the unmistakable, sweet, and sickening smell of decay. They continued around to the very back of the structure, where they finally found an entrance. The doorway was blocked by a large, rusted sheet of tin metal that had been propped up against the gap in the concrete wall. One of the riders stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the metal sheet, and dragged it aside with a loud, scraping screech. A few of the armed riders immediately stepped through the threshold, holding their weapons high, ready to fight off any guards or kidnappers who might be waiting in the shadows. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light inside the warehouse, their weapons slowly lowered. The anger faded from their faces, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. In the middle of the dirt floor lay a tilted concrete slab propped up on stones with a blood-stained wooden bowl positioned to catch runoff. Surrounding this slaughtering slab were human bones, some still with decaying flesh clinging to them. Along the walls, chained up like animals, were 23 skeletal, barely alive people who had been kept in a catatonic state. These captives were being systematically harvested for their body parts to fuel a highly lucrative, illegal black market trade in ritual magic materials. Herbalists in Nigeria paid massive sums for fresh human organs and limbs, believing they would grant wealth and power to their clients. The warehouse was essentially a body part factory where victims were kept alive and butchered on demand. In the back rooms, searchers also discovered a crude guillotine and a live chained crocodile, which the captors used to dispose of the dead or those who could no longer survive the harvesting process. According to the locals living nearby, they had seen a black Jeep with tinted windows drive down a rough, hidden path to the warehouse every single night at 8 o'clock for the last 10 years. Each night, the forest would echo with horrific, blood-curdling screams until the Jeep departed around 9:30. The locals had repeatedly complained to the police, but the police brushed them off and told them to ignore it. It turned out the driver of the Jeep was the primary distributor of the harvested parts, delivering them directly to wealthy clients. When the Okada mob stormed the property, the guards and the driver of the Jeep fled through the hidden road, leaving the survivors behind. The riders quickly smashed the heavy chains to free the 23 survivors, but as they searched the faces of the barely conscious victims, they realized Lanre was not among them. They began searching the mass graves outside, but there was still no trace of their missing friend. Lanre had said on the phone that he was locked in an underground cell, but the warehouse had a solid concrete floor. The Okadas desperately searched the property for a hidden entrance, hammering on the ground and begging the catatonic survivors for answers, but they got nothing. When the police finally arrived, the riders begged them to bring heavy digging equipment to excavate the site. Instead, the police cordoned off the area and, within days, brought in bulldozers to completely demolish the warehouse, burying any hidden chambers under a mountain of rubble. Many believed the police did this to cover up their own corruption and complicity. For weeks, the Okadas returned with shovels to dig through the debris, but they never found the underground cell. It is believed that Lanre and the other 8 captives remained trapped beneath the earth, suffocating in the dark. While no one was ever legally prosecuted, the Okadas did deliver a swift form of street justice. A few days after the discovery, they caught a suspicious man wandering the ruins with several fresh human tongues in his pockets and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. Assuming he was part of the harvesting ring, the mob killed him on the spot. Later, a well-educated survivor revealed how she had been kidnapped by men in a fake police van, stripped naked at the clothing shack, and chained inside the warehouse to watch others get butchered. Her story exposed how easily ordinary people were snatched from the safety of their homes to feed the insatiable demand of the black market. The Soka Forest remains a dark scar on the history of Ibadan, a place where hundreds of innocent people vanished into the shadows and where a frantic plea for help came just a few feet too late. The Soka Forest tragedy left the community of Ibadan in a state of absolute shock and mourning. For years, the families of the missing had been ignored, their desperate pleas for help treated as minor inconveniences by the very authorities who were supposed to protect them. The revelation that a human slaughterhouse had been operating right on the outskirts of their city for over a decade, right under the noses of the local police, completely shattered any remaining trust the public had in the system. The Okada riders, who had shown immense bravery by banding together and marching into the dark woods to save one of their own, were left with a hollow victory. They had saved 23 lives, a truly heroic feat, but they were forced to live with the agonizing knowledge that they could not save their friend Lanre. The silence from the ground where the warehouse once stood remains a heavy, suffocating weight. The concrete and soil of Soka Forest still hold secrets that may never be brought to light, and the families of those who disappeared are left to wonder if their loved ones' final moments were spent in the suffocating dark of an underground cell that was paved over by the hands of the law. It is a haunting reminder of the dark forces that can hide in plain sight and the lengths to which some will go for wealth and power. The stories of the survivors who managed to escape the Soka Forest warehouse serve as a stark testament to the resilience of the human spirits in the face of absolute darkness. These individuals, who were stripped of their clothes, their names, and their basic humanity, have had to walk a long and painful road toward healing. Many of them continue to suffer from severe physical ailments and deep psychological trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. But their survival also stands as a permanent indictment of a broken system that failed them for so many years. The forest may have slowly reclaimed the physical ruins of the warehouse, but the memory of what happened there can never be completely erased. It forces us all to look much more closely at the quiet shadows that exist in our own backyards today. Before you go, just remember this: somewhere beneath that forest, there may still be voices that were never heard and never will be. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know in the comments and check out the rest of our true crime stories. Because sometimes the scariest stories don't have endings. Until next time.